conversation on contemporary issues in the U.S. For those of you who are new to the Danforth Center, we're a pretty unique enterprise, the only group of faculty, fellows, and students who are devoted to both foster rigorous scholarship and to educate both the university, campus community, and the broader public about the complicated intersections of religion and politics in U.S. history. I think most of you do know us, but if you don't, please ask us what we do. There's information in the table just outside this main auditorium for you, and we encourage you to take that. Before I turn things over to the organizer of today's event, Rachel Gross, I do want to announce that the Danforth Center's final public event of this academic year will take place on May 9. That is a graduate student conference on religion and sexual revolutions, featuring a public keynote address by University of Delaware historian Rebecca Davis. Excuse me, that keynote lecture is at 5:30 p.m. in Amrath Lounge. For those who are interested in attending the graduate student panels during the day, it's going to be sort of a pretty small, focused gathering, but it is open. But I've been advised by the organizer, our dissertation fellow, Emily Johnson, that registration is required by April 15th, which is a week from today. So do register if you'd like to come to those panels. If you only want to come to the 5:30 keynote lecture, you can just show up. We always appreciate RSVPs because it helps us plan, but you can always come. So now I just want to offer my warmest appreciation to the organizer and moderator of today's event, Rachel Gross, who shares with Emily the title of Dissertation Fellow at the Danforth Center this academic year. As part of this fellowship program, we offer our dissertation fellows the chance to put on an event that would be of interest to the university and the broader community. And here for us today, we were very pleased that Rachel chose to take on such a timely and contentious subject as food, religion, and politics. And she's assembled a wonderful panel, as you see here, and she'll introduce the panelists in a moment. Rachel is completing her PhD in religion at Princeton University, where she has already distinguished herself with a number of grants and fellowships. She has also taken numerous opportunities for professional presentations, conference presentations, and other activities, as well as some publications, such as her article, Who Counts as a Jew, which appeared in our own Religion and Politics journal last October. This summer, she will defend her dissertation, which is entitled Objects of Affection, the Material Religion of American Jewish Nostalgia. And I'm also delighted to announce that she recently accepted a teaching position at Virginia Tech, where she will start in August. It's been a tremendous pleasure having both Rachel and Emily with us this year, and we're going to miss them greatly upon their impending departure. As she comes now to take over the proceedings, please join me in thanking Rachel for bringing us together today for what promises to be an excellent panel. Thank you.
Wonderful introduction and for her masterful guidance of the center. Some more thanks are in order, especially as ritualized gratitude is appropriate at an event about religion and food. An enormous thank you to the impressive staff at the center who did so much to make this event happen. Dr. Rachel Lindsay, the superb associate director of the center, Deborah Kennard, the center's incredible communications specialist, and Sherry Pena, this administrative assistant extraordinaire. Thank you also to all of the faculty and the postdocs of the center who have made it such an enjoyable and productive place to work and to teach this year. Thank you to our director, Marie Griffith, Darren Dochek, Mark Jordan, Lori Mackley-Kitt, Lee Schmidt, Lerone Martin, and Ann Blankenship. A special thank you to my fellow dissertation fellow, Emily Johnson, who probably deserves credit as an unofficial co-organizer or co-author on anything I organize or produce this year. Thank you to all of the students in my course on American Jewish food, religion, and politics, who have helped me think through these issues and think through the questions that I will be asking our panelists tonight, and who, not coincidentally, are required to be here. But I still thank you for your presence. I am learning so much from all of you. Last but not least, thank you to all of the panelists for traveling from near and far to be here to participate in tonight's conversation. And thank you to everybody for being here tonight. The panelists and I look forward to your questions at the end of the panel. A brief word about the structure of tonight's proceedings. I will say a few words about introducing this event, and then we will hear short presentations from each of the panelists about his or her work. We will then have about 30 minutes of moderated roundtable conversation, moderated by me, and then we'll have about 30 minutes to hear from all of you. The questions from all of you are an important part of tonight's proceedings. As historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto writes, food may claim to be considered the world's most important topic. It's what matters to most people most of the time. And it's probably what most of us are thinking about at any given moment. And food is trendy right now. Food justice, issues of food insecurity, and reevaluations of the industrial food system are gaining more and more attention from devoted activists and have gained the attention of the popular press. Americans and others around the world are evaluating the politics of food, the sources of power that undergird the production, regulation, distribution, and consumption of food. At the same time, every religious tradition that I'm aware of has traditions relating food to the concept of the sacred, through regulating consumption and through rituals involving special activities and special foods. Today, we will have a conversation bringing together these two strands, contemporary food issues and religious traditions. At this moment, religious food activists and entrepreneurs are gaining traction, and scholars of religion have begun belatedly to turn serious attention to food waste, the study of how people eat and how they think about and use food. This roundtable brings together individuals doing important work on food, religion, and politics in distinct fields who otherwise might not have a chance to come together in conversation. While Christians, Jews, and scholars of religious studies are engaged in their own conversations about these issues, they are rarely brought together to share their parallel work. We will discuss how they and the people they study are bringing religious approaches and traditions to bear on the pressing issues of our day, such as sustainability and labor concerns. This panel is, of course, not representative of all American religious traditions, nor will we cover all issues related to food and politics in our conversation. Rather, the goal is to begin a productive interfaith and interdisciplinary conversation that will continue in many different venues beyond our time together tonight. And now a brief introduction to all of our panelists at once in the interest of time, in the order in which they will present their own work. Karen Adelman is the co-owner of Saul's Deli in Berkeley, California, with her partner, Peter Levitt. Adelman and Levitt work to make Saul's, in their words, an authentic, vibrant, and relevant Jewish delicatessen. They serve dishes drawn from throughout Jewish history and work to minimize the impact of the industrial food system. Adelman and Levitt serve local and organic produce, artisanal products, and humane and sustainable meat and fish. Karen began working tables at Saul's after her publishing office was crushed in the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. Eventually, Karen came to manage Saul's and called Peter out of teaching to help her purchase and run Saul's restaurant and delicatessen. They have organized and participated in a number of events with Deli colleagues, including the referendum on the Jewish Deli menu with their regular patron Michael Pollan in 2010, and Deli Summit, the Renaissance, in 2011. Jason Fowler is the co-founder, along with his wife Pamela, of the Sustainable Traditions Project and their local food initiative, Land and Table, in Lynchburg, Virginia. Sustainable Traditions is a beautiful online magazine providing a conversation on whole-life Christian faith, intentional communal living, and sustaining the environment, among other topics. Through Land and Table, their grassroots community development initiative, the Fowlers are cultivating a network of farmers, food producers, food artisans, eaters, gardeners, and homesteaders in the Lynchburg regional area, working to change the way the region eats. They live on a scenic farm near the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, along with their 7 children, one born very recently, congratulations, working toward missional Christian community, new agrarian living, and holistic embodiment of the teachings of Jesus. Rabbi Dr. Shmuly Yanklowitz is the founder and president of Uri L'Tzedek, Awaken to Justice, an Orthodox social justice organization guided by Torah values and dedicated to combating suffering and oppression, including working toward ethical kashrut, the practice of keeping kosher. In 2009, Uri L'Tzedek launched the Tav HaYosher, an ethical seal certifying that kosher restaurants meet the standards of fair pay, fair work time, and a safe work environment for their employees. Rabbi Shmuly is also the founder and CEO of the Shemayim Va'aretz, Heaven and Earth Institute, a spiritual community of Jewish vegans working to promote veganism within the Jewish community and to address issues of animal welfare, environmental, and health veganism. Rabbi Shmuly is the author of Jewish Ethics and Social Justice, a guide for the 21st century and epistemic development in Talmud study, and the forthcoming The Soul of Jewish Social Justice. He completed his doctorate at Columbia University in Moral Development and Epistemology. Yanklowitz was ordained as a rabbi at Yeshivat Chobabei Torah, the YCT Rabbinical School. In 2012 and 2013, Newsweek rated Rabbi Shmuly one of the top 50 rabbis in America. Dr. Jennifer Ayres is an assistant professor of religious education and the director of religious education program at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Ayres is the author of Waiting for a Glacier to Move, Practicing Social Witness, and Good Food, Grounded Practical Theology, based on her ethnographic study of the food practices of diverse religious communities and her examination of issues of faith formation through religious practices of food justice. Ayres also researches faith formation in the context of popular culture, pedagogical theory and practice, feminist practical theology, social activism and religious moral formation, and eco-theology and the global food system. She has also written for Feasting on the Word commentary series and the Being Reformed adult study series. She received her PhD from Emory University Graduate Division of Religion in Person, Community, and Religious Life. Finally, last but not least, Dr. Benjamin Zeller is an assistant professor of religion at Lake Forest College in the Chicago metro area. He researches new and alternative religious currents, including new religions, religious engagement with science, and the quasi-religious relationship people have with food, focusing particularly on vegetarians and locavores. He is the author of Prophets and Protons, New Religious Movements and Science in Late 20th Century America. He is the co-editor of Religion, Food, and Eating in North America, for which I had the distinct pleasure of working with Ben as a contributor to the volume. And he also co-edited the Bloomsbury Companion to New Religious Movements. He He is co-general editor of Nova Religio, the Journal of Alternative and Emergent Religions. Zeller received his PhD in Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He is a fan of fermented foods and always has sauerkraut growing in his house. He is also a home cheesemaker, and he'd like us to know that he's rather fond of Gouda. And now I'll turn it over to Karen Adelman. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Karen Adelman, and I'm from Saul's restaurant in Berkeley, California. Rachel asked me to come and talk about my experience in the restaurant and how running a Jewish deli intersects with some of the big political, ecological, ultimately moral questions of the day. And it's true, it does. The iconic deli is a deeply nostalgic venture, serving comfort foods of the Jews, reflecting first the dishes of the American Jews of Eastern European descent, and then secondly, it's filtering the experience through the delis of New York City specifically. It started as kosher, as home away from home, and the different foods were separate. Over time, as Americans, Jews assimilated, they came to be morphed into one, at that point, secular warehousing for these foods. And it also blended into American cuisine in general. Oh yeah, behind me, pictures of mostly delis and a couple of things to put in there. Anyway, at these delis, there were very big menus. It was sort of like all of the traditions came together under one roof. Giant menus serving the same thing every day of the year. Giant sandwiches, too. The New York experience was a very specific historical moment. And after the World Wars, all of the European Jews, Eastern European Jews came. When they got to America, their prosperity increased, and also their reliance on mass production in the food system, industrial foods. At one point, there were 1,500 or more delis in New York City, and now that's not the case. I'm not sure if you guys have heard about David Sachs, wrote a book called Save the Deli, and it wasn't just hyperbole. There really aren't that many delis left, and it's partly because of the way we eat now, which is different, and it's also partly that it didn't pass forward to the next generation. At Saul's, we are not a kosher deli. I'm a representative of the secular tradition, and the deli is in what's by some people called the gourmet ghetto, which I wince at because it's really one of many places that have important histories in the food scene. But actually, and it's a tourist destination. There's people that come just to go there. But important things actually did happen there, and one of them is that Alice Waters had the restaurant Chez Panisse. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but it was very important. She promoted local and organic, and this was long before those were terms that most people thought about or used. And she supported these farms, sometimes when their crops weren't even good, and she kept them going while the rest of the country enjoyed the conversation. And by the time they did, she had been doing it for 10, 15, 20 years already. Also there was an early wave of artisanal small producers creating a kind of alternative to the industrial food system. At Saul's, our journey to what sort of, we're kind of loosely using the term sustainable here, and certainly for us it's been a moving target. I'm not sure what the official definition is, but the idea is something for the long term, something healthier, something. For us, it started with organic, and I'm going to just take up briefly the whole arc, and then we'll go over some examples. I'm going to start with organic, which led to local, which led to clean, which we made up entirely for ourselves. Clean is sort of the best choice possible, and we're calling that sustainable. And it's, you've never arrived, and there have been retrenchments, But once you start down that path, you can't really leave it, as far as I'm concerned. We tasted, so one of the first things we did was look at menu size. Deli was always a giant menu. We tasted all over the country. We realized that a large menu doesn't usually produce very good outcomes. And economically, it's not very easy to organize. It's not good, which was the second thing that we were trying to do. There's this, in the Jewish deli, there's these dishes, and they have to go everywhere. And it doesn't matter what season it is, even though what might have been in a Polish winter, doesn't really make that much sense in a New York summer, and it certainly doesn't make any sense in a California spring. And so it's not that we didn't serve that, we would just serve it in its time. But that was sort of a radical idea at the time, that a deli menu would be a seasonal menu. So we started going through the menu one item at a time and trying to address those issues. Early on, we also had to address the New York question. It used to be that a Jewish deli was a New York deli, even if you weren't in New York, which literally meant you would take your ingredients, shrink wrap them or freeze them, and ship them, truck them, fly them to California. And that was how you were an authentic New York deli. And we started that way at all. In fact, I think there was a little tagline for a restaurant, a New York deli in Berkeley, and then that changed into a deli on the Upper North Side. It's run north side of Berkeley. And we had pictures all over the restaurant of New York delis. And one by one, as we moved along through the years, we started dismantling this idea. Because really, just on the face of it, it doesn't make any sense at all. And it's a terrible carbon footprint. You're flying all your food that's not even good by the time it gets there. People would brag, oh, bagels from New York. That's ludicrous. Bagels are good for a certain number of time. But that was how it went for all delis. And it begs the question of what deli food is. Is it New York food? Is it Ashkenazi food? Is it Jewish food? We sort of have generally been the most beloved foods are the Eastern European dishes. And we have also added Sephardic dishes from other places because it matches more how people want to eat now. One of the first things we did is get a good rye bread that was organic. But rye bread here is meant to be corn rye. It's very light. It's mostly wheat. Just has a little bit of rye. But the actual original rye cultures in Eastern Europe, it had a lot of rye, no wheat or very little wheat, and it was dark and chewy. And we kind of designed a bread with Acme Bakery, which is a local baker, and it's organic flours. And it had a crust that was a little darker than the traditional, at that point, LA rye. But and people objected. So we were going back to not just New York, but where it came from before then, and that was a radical idea. Okay, so we did organic meat, organic ketchup, organic honey, organic milk, although organic milk was really expensive. And then that moved into this idea of local, so we were trying to get most things local. Oh, the other really radical thing we did is we took Dr. Brown's cream soda off the menu, and we started making our own sodas and our own cream soda because these were bottles that we chucked in from New York, and they had tons of, if you look at this label, they had tons of additives, and they were barely made out of anything you could recognize anymore. And we thought, surely nostalgia is not going to keep us from good sense. And we had this special machine made for us because Coke and Pepsi own all the equipment for soda making, and you get their syrups, and then you get soda water. And so we had these old machinists and beer makers, and very like a team of people that got together, a SWAT team that got together and made us a soda machine and this was a long time ago. Now you hear a lot about people have seltzer in their restaurants, but we were trailblazing. And people still freak out about the Dr. Brown's because that's how you know we're in a deli. And okay, so we did what we could, and then we came up with this idea that we would make choices that were clean, which means the best possible choice. Sometimes you can really push it, and sometimes it's not feasible, or there aren't options, and you have to. So we would always go for the clean, and we would variously be asked, what you call it at the time, which we call it eco-kosher, which wasn't something then, but now it is, which I'm really, really happy about. Okay, so then we got rid of all our cans and bottles, but then we had to bring some back, because when people are going home, they can't really use our stainless steel soda container. They just want a bottle, and they don't want to, oh my God, it's 10 minutes. Okay, I have a lot more to say. Let me just jump ahead to my ending. So I can really rattle on sometimes. Okay, we went on a lot of different things. Most of our customers just want a bagel or a strawberry sandwich, and they're surprised to find themselves engaged in thorny issues about the food system. And we're pushing up against, are people willing to pay the real costs of food? And, in some cases, I'm not sure that they are. I'm really heading towards my conclusion here. What does a deli look like post the food apocalypse? What are the sustainable dishes? Most of our clientele has gone along with some greening without complaint. But people still need to gather together. Food is a comfort and a powerful way of passing culture. The future of the deli might look a lot more like the past. There will always be a place for a Jewish and cultural food eatery, but I don't know what that it will look like New York City in that time period, or that it should. And I'll leave it there for now.
Next we'll hear from Jason Fowler.
Greetings from the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. So my wife and I started Sustainable Traditions. It was born out of a personal crisis, of a crisis of vocation. We moved from the Northern Virginia area down towards the more rural part of Virginia, and began asking questions about, I was job searching, and so we were asking questions about, what should I be doing with my life? Should I just be earning a paycheck? We were looking for a church, so we started asking questions. What should the church look like? How does my work integrate with, my work life, church life, family life? For most of us, those things kind of float in spheres that don't always connect. And living in the hectic environment of Northern Virginia, we were just wondering and feeling that God was calling us to integrate all the pieces of our life. Sustainable Traditions really is a conversation on what does it mean to holistically follow Jesus and embody His kingdom in the world. Instead of having a compartmentalized faith or a dualistic faith where you say these things are sacred and these things are secular. What does it look like to make the Lord Lord of every aspect of our life? One of my favorite writers is Wendell Berry. Maybe you've heard of him. He's a little famous, agrarian writer who said a few things, and he said this. Instead of relaying to you my whole journey, I think it's Wendell Berry sums it up. He says, the dominant religious view for a long time has been that the body is a kind of script issued by the great company store in the sky, which can be cashed in to redeem the soul, but is otherwise worthless. And the predictable result has been a human creature able to appreciate or tolerate only the spiritual or mental part of creation, and full of semi-conscious hatred of the physical or natural part, which is ready and willing to destroy for salvation, for profit, for victory, or for fun. This madness constitutes the norm of modern humanity and of modern Christianity. But to despise the body or mistreat it for the sake of the soul is not just to burn one's house for the insurance, nor is it just self-hatred of the most deep and dangerous sort. It is yet another blasphemy. It is to make nothing, and worse than nothing, of the great something in which we live and move and have our being. I've sort of gone through a series of, Jesus talks about, you have to be converted and become like a child. And I feel like Scripture talks about being sanctified, and that we're going through. For me, it's almost like a series of conversions. And for me, reading Wendell Berry was one of those conversion points. Moving onto a farm and learning how to milk a cow are all things that were really radical for me, and became to have meaning as my theology shifted, in understanding that the end of the gospel is not going to a disembodied heaven, but heaven coming to earth, and the idea of resurrection and new creation. And so we all live backwards from the future, and so what your view of the future is going to affect how you live out your faith or your beliefs. And so ideas have consequences. One of the consequences of my theology shifting, in an understanding that the end is new creation. Scripture talks about new creation, in the restoration of all things. All of a sudden, my body matters. All of a sudden, creation matters. All of a sudden, food matters. Agriculture matters. And also, within the community that I live, we have friends who are farmers, who are sustainable farmers, and we began meeting on a monthly basis and talking about what we could do to grow the local food movement, and what we wanted local leaders to do to help grow the local food movement. So, what can we do, and what do we want the leaders to do for us? We've been meeting for 2 to 3 years, and have really sought to cultivate relationships. When it boils down to it, everything's about relationships. Even if you're talking about the economy, the local economy, reviving your community. Rural communities are kind of torn apart in many ways by how the economy has gone, how industry has gone, and as a follower of Jesus, my wife and I felt compelled to, what Scripture says, seeking the shalom of the community that we're in, seeking the wholeness. So where you see brokenness, identify that brokenness and say, what is God calling me to do to heal this brokenness? And for us, it was the local food movement, helping to cultivate that. And it's a little difficult because we're in a conventional farming community, and so on one side you have local leaders going, how can we lift regulations so that we can have more confined animal feeding operations in the county? And then you have us on the other side saying, so how can we have a future, and not destroy ourselves? And how can we, as my farming friends, how can they? We live on a farm, but it's more of a homesteading farm. How do my friends who are farmers who are making a living full time, how can they stay in business? And so we're asking a lot of questions about, how can we reconcile with the conventional farmers and fight with them in a healthy way, I guess, oppose them in a healthy way, but also to grow something that's so fragile. For us, the local food movement is really in a seminal state, and even among us, we're asking questions like, what is sustainable agriculture? Like you're asking, the triple bottom line, ecologically, economically, and socially. How can we be viable? How can we proliferate? How can we renew ourselves continually? Instead of destroying ourselves for the money or for what we feel is a necessity. So, I'm doing this as a Christian because I feel motivated to love my community but our project is called Land and Table, and it's not faith-based, but it's us engaging the community and building relationships, and we feel like, I can't just preach the gospel, I have to embody it, and Jesus said, love God and love your neighbor, and so we're trying to do that in a small way. I hope in 10 years maybe I can come back and say, it's been a success, but I think it's always a struggle to build relationships and to seek, the health of the community.
Thank you, Jason. We'll hear from Rabbi Dr. Shmuly after this.
Thank you. It's really a great honor to be here. Thank you, Rachel, for the invitation to learn from these great panelists and from all of you. I also noticed there's two amazing Jewish clergy people in the room. It's significant that they're here. This is the most crazy week on the Jewish calendar leading into Passover, where there's no free time. People clean their houses like crazy to get rid of this bread. The second best thing to marrying my wife, aside from marrying her, was that I now have in-laws and we go to their house for Passover, which means we don't have to clean our house, which is really a wonderful thing. So it's a big sacrifice to be here this week. And it's great to be with you all for this very rich topic, which I spend a lot of my waking and sleeping hours thinking about around food, politics, and religion. So, as Rachel mentioned, we founded the Orthodox Social Justice Organization, in 2007. Now, there's many Jewish social justice organizations. In fact, I'm on a Jewish social justice roundtable, which has about 30 of those organizations. But this is the first and only Orthodox one, the most traditional segment of the Jewish community, which is engaged in this work. And it seemed clear to us, just on the biblical level, that the dozens of times that the Torah, that the Bible reminds us to care for the stranger, to care for the vulnerable, that the work of being religious is about going out to the vulnerable and to the oppressed, and to the alienated, and to be in solidarity with them. And so we started to build this movement in 2007. Actually, since we're leading to Passover, so the Israelites are coming out of Egypt. The whole story of Passover is where this message is learned. You were slaves in Egypt, and so you should protect the vulnerable in your time. And what happens is the Israelites come out of Egypt, and they come out of the sea, the split sea, and they see the Egyptians drowning, and they finally realize their freedom. Right? They finally realize they're going to be liberated. And what do they want to do? They want to sing. But the rabbis say they don't know how to sing. They've been slaves for centuries. They don't know how to sing. So they look up in the sky and they see birds chirping. And from those birds chirping, they once again learn how to sing. And I'm thinking about this rabbinic teaching this week because it's about how do those who are oppressed regain their voices, right? How do we find invisible people in society who are not seen, who are not heard, and be a voice for them and give them sight to their story? And how do we teach them once again to sing and then learn from their song as well? And so we started to build this organization, and only a year later was the largest immigration raid in U.S. history. In Postville, Iowa, a company called Rabashkins, or agri-processors, was raided, and about 400 workers, 396 workers were arrested by the ICE, Department of Homeland Security. And at the time, that was the largest. I believe now it's the second largest immigration rate since then. And what emerged from that story was that significant abuses that were happening in this plant around denial of wages, paying below minimum wage, denial of breaks, overtime, this and that. And my colleague and I went to Postville, Iowa, and met with these individuals who were wearing anklets, that the government had put on them, as like they were animals. And we launched an international boycott against this company. And within about a week or so, 2,000 rabbis and Jewish leaders signed on to support it. And this was kind of unheard of. A group of Orthodox rabbis and leaders saying, hey, we care enough about kosher food and the kosher values and the Torah values that we're actually going to take a public stand against a kosher facility. Now, this was not just any facility. They were producing 60% of the kosher beef in the country, 40% of the kosher chicken. This was the kosher industry in America. And we said, we believe in the values of kashrut. I'll tell you a story. I was on a panel at Yeshiva University some years ago. And one of the panelists who spoke after me said something. He said, "This is all nice, but let me give you an analogy." He says, "Nobody cares if the poet stinks." He said, when they read poetry, what they want is quality poetry. Nobody cares about the hygiene of the poet. He said, so too here. The kosher consumers, they don't care about the ethics behind this. They just want cheap and good tasting meat. And my work and our work since then has been to try to prove this individual wrong, to say that actually those who are part of the kosher industry care deeply about the values of the worker, of the animal, of the environment, of the trade agreements, and the like, and have been leading our response since then. Now, just going back to that case for a moment, the boycott became so strong that the Rabbi family asked to meet with us, which we did, and we basically said, listen, if you make your plant transparent, in terms of that you're meeting basic law, we'll call off the boycott, and they did, and we called it off. So, of course, the sort of right wing critiqued us for doing the boycott, the so-called left wing critiqued us for ending the boycott. You can't win when you do activism, oftentimes. But that was what happened. But we said, listen, this is not a sustainable response. We can't just launch a boycott whenever there's a problem in the news. It's very difficult to verify what's really happening and getting inside and understanding. And so we said we have to create something more sustainable. And so we launched something called the Tav Yosher, which is an ethical seal for kosher establishments, certifying that they're not only kosher but yosher. Yosher in Hebrew sort of means just. We say we care just as much for us as religious Jews about the ritual standards as we do about the ethical standards. We want to know the workers treated properly. How do we establish the ethical transparency? Now we started to succeed, so the Department of Labor called us and they said, how can we learn from you? How can we build a model like this? I said, Department of Labor, you want to learn from our little dinky, $300,000 budget organization? They said, listen, we don't know how to do this. They said, we don't have the funding to regulate restaurants, right? They didn't have the funding to actually go out. So, of course, they could do immigration raids when they want, but actually regulating labor, are people really making? It's really nice when minimum wage goes up. I mean, people who want that, it's really nice for them. I happen to be someone who wants that. But when it goes up, it's oftentimes not even regulated, especially for undocumented workers who are living in tremendous fear. So we launched this ethical seal. It's now in about 90 to 100 establishments across the country. And we did that because we have a power base. We believe kashrut, meaning the kosher establishment, is a vehicle for social justice. It is a vehicle for creating change. And so we have a very strong power base of kosher consumers who will only want to support establishments who make these types of commitments. And so that was 2000. That was 2008 was the raid. May 12, 2008. May 12, 2009. We launched this Tav Yosher. It was modeled off of a similar project called the Tav Hevrati in Israel, which has 400 certifications on kosher and non-kosher restaurants in Israel. Primarily, we're dealing with Latino American workers in the States. Primarily, they're dealing with Arab workers in Israel. Those who are in the back rooms, cleaning and the like, who are oftentimes don't receive their basic rights. Now, part of what this was motivated by was that the very first, I don't use the word sin. I happen to view it as a Christian word. I love a lot of Christian words, but I like to use Jewish words as a rabbi. And so I don't really use the word sin. But the first wrong in the Torah, what is it? I mean, everyone knows it. Is the eating of the fruit, right? Now, what happens when they eat this fruit is they eat it from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So with the first act of food consumption becomes the birth of morality, right? This is pretty radical if you think about it. That morality in the biblical tradition is born out of food consumption, right? It is in that first food choice that they become aware of good and evil, right? That's really powerful to me. And so that inspired us to say that what's happening in the world today, I think, is this: all these values are intersecting in how the food industry is run. And so when I make a bracha, when I make a blessing on food, which I make before I eat or drink anything, I ask myself a question on a good day, on a good moment. On a good moment, I ask myself, not only what is this food, what blessing do I make? That's all a complicated thing. But how are the workers treated in producing this food? Right? How are the animals treated in this? What was the environmental impact? Right? How about the fair trade factor? right? There's all these different questions I begin to think about. How about the health factor? What's going into my body, right? And so all these questions start to emerge, and that becomes a part of my spiritual practice. Now, this is not just political for me. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel once said, we affirm the separation of church and state, religion and state, but we reject the separation of religion from the human condition, which is to say that I believe deeply that these issues, which many call politics, or the human condition, that religion is about that for me. It's not ghettoized into that sanctuary, but it's about how we live ethically and spiritually. Just one last idea on that is Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who was the founder of something called the Musar movement, which is the Jewish ethical and spiritual movement. Famously, one of his most famous quotes is that the physical needs of another are my spiritual needs. And so I believe that the spiritual practice of kashrut is ultimately about addressing certain ethics in society. And I have a very deep faith in that institution, that it can be a leading light. And I'm going to forfeit my time up card. I thought I'd do that. Thanks.
Rabbi Shmuly, and now Dr. Jennifer Ayres.
Thank you, Rachel, so much. What a pleasure. I'm just really enjoying myself. Food matters. It matters, in fact, so much that it's often a memorable character in some of our favorite films. Films like Soul Food or Babette's Feast or Julie and Julia. Food nourishes, bonds, soothes, inspires, celebrates, heals, and connects. If a film were to be made of your life, what is one food or recipe that would be featured prominently in that film? For me, it's a tomato sandwich. In the summers of a Southern childhood, whole meals are made of fresh vegetables from plants in the backyard or in the roadside produce stand. Suppers taken out on the back porch might boast a steamy cob of silver queen corn, some cucumbers sprinkled with vinegar, a slice of Vidalia onion, and the ubiquitous tomato sandwich. Thick slices of misshapen, ruby-hued tomatoes rest upon white bread, dressed only with Duke's mayonnaise, I don't know what's in that, and gracious amounts of black pepper. Mopping up the tomato juice dribbling down their chins, family members share laughter and tall tales, reveling into the late evening. Such meals fortify the affective bonds between sisters and brothers, between parents and children. They were a ritual of sorts, and remind me that food shows us not only something about our social relationships, but also about our relationship to a good God who provides these gifts for us. In many ways, then, the table is a site for divine encounter. And yet, before we wax too theological, we are caught, because the tomato sandwich is not a simple and accessible meal for so many in the United States. Indeed, the main ingredient, the simple tomato, presents a moral dilemma in our food system. Struggling farmers have difficulty making a living growing produce, and migrant workers are paid very little and suffer difficult and sometimes abusive working conditions in the fields. In many neighborhoods in the U.S., even sorry excuses for tomatoes may not even be available or are priced so high that it costs more to buy that single tomato than to buy a fast food hamburger. And I haven't even touched on the other crises in our food system: abused animals, stripped soil, abandoned communities too. These all challenge simple theological affirmations of divine encounter in the food system. So when we talk about food, we encounter both the God who creates and provides, as well as the brokenness and alienation in our system. For many of our religious traditions, the site of this confrontation is a table around which we orient ourselves on a regular basis. The fact that, for example, the earliest Christian communities experienced conflict around the communion meal suggests that for them, as for us, the table is the core of theological and moral knowing. Embedded in this expanded table theology are at least three core affirmations that orient the Christian faith. First, when Christians refer to this communion meal as the Eucharist, we acknowledge its literal meaning, that is, thanksgiving. We express our thanksgiving for God's gifts, and we also promise to distribute them justly. The principle of just distribution means that we cannot ignore serious issues of food insecurity in poor urban and rural communities, nor can we ignore unjust wages and working conditions for agricultural laborers. Second, Christians are reminded at the Eucharistic table that the meals that Jesus shared with his friends also served to proclaim and enact the nearness of the kingdom of God. In other words, signifying an alternative future in which God restores relationships among persons, communities, and the earth, in which death does not have the last word. In light of the challenges we face, this is a significant challenge. What prevents any of us from giving up, throwing up our hands in despair? But today I want to think more intentionally about this third theological affirmation, that the Eucharist is at its core about belonging and membership. Christians approaching the Eucharistic table might, in other meals, experience a great distance between their eating and the lives of farmers and laborers, agriculture, and even other people eating. Eating is something we often do alone, maybe out of a takeout container, and one could hardly identify the origins of that meal or the conditions under which it was prepared. But Paul reminded the Corinthians, for example, that in this Eucharist meal we are bound to one another. His admonition to discern the body immediately follows his descriptions of the church as the body of Christ. But when we think about food as a commodity, something that we buy, then our responsibility really goes no further than paying a price for that commodity. Christians around the communion table, however, are not mere consumers. Indeed, we are together members of a community. Paul says members of Christ's body. We're members of a global communion, and indeed members of creation. In an alienating world that dismembers all participants in the food system, we are remembered at the Eucharist table. So this is the theological imagination that I argue in my book is cultivated at the Eucharistic table. We learn these three things: that God is the giver of all good gifts, and our responsibility in the face of this giving is to express our gratitude and to commit ourselves to the equitable distribution of these gifts. And that in this meal we are offered a glimpse of the kingdom of God, God's alternative future of abundance and vitality. And that we belong, we are members of God's body, the church, Christ's body, the church, and God's body, the earth. So where does this theological imagination lead us? This table theology gives us rise to four moral commitments, and I'll just address these as I close. First, we're convicted of the priority of the hungry. An abundant feast convicts religious communities wherever whole communities around them are described as food deserts, with little or no access to fresh, healthy, affordable food. And rural families living in the U.S. agricultural heartland are food insecure. Second, we must seek justice for those who work the land. When we receive the bread in the cup, we receive in our bodies the fruits of the labors of farmers and agricultural workers in the U.S. and around the world. Farmers and agricultural laborers are, however, poorer and more likely to face food insecurity than persons in other vocations. Third, we receive a charge to tend the earth. We consume in the sacred meals the simple fruits of the earth, wheat and grapes. Insofar as the earth yields these fruits that we bless, break, and share, it demands gratitude and reverence. And yet we live in a time in which our agricultural practices are anything but restrained, depleting the soil and exploiting animals. Finally, all three of these moral commitments depend on one deeper, more fundamental orientation. It requires the cultivation of a keen sense of the interrelatedness of humanity and indeed all creation. If one receives no other moral challenge from the Eucharistic table, it is this one. Having received the radical gift of membership in the body of Christ, the human sacred obligation then is to continually seek, tend, and nurture the bonds of connectedness in God's whole creation. This work is hard in our alienated world, but in the book I try to tell stories of people who are doing just this, who are cultivating this keen sense of connectedness, like farming in the churchyard in the midst of what others have called a desert, or traveling to Mexico to witness the struggles and innovations of traditional farmers, hosting a farmer's market in the church basement, supporting the rights of workers, touching and cultivating the earth, tending a sow that they know by name. In these practices, hope is born. At their heart, these instances of fragile goodness and interdependence stand as a witness to the sin and brokenness, I'm okay with using that word, sin and brokenness that characterizes the food system, that make truly good food a near impossibility, but they also serve as windows of grace, demonstrating care for the poor, dignity for the laborer, reverence for all forms of life, and a way of life deeply related to others, the earth, and to God. These stories then are a testimony to people who have come truly alive.
Thank you, Jennifer, and finally, Dr. Benjamin Zeller.
Thank you. So I've been asked to give a couple of comments on the relationship between food, religion, and politics from the perspective of the scholarship of those topics. I'm not an activist. I'm basically an historian. The comments I'm going to give you are from two perspectives. One is from the research I've done, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But the other perspective is as the founding chair of the Religion, Food, and Eating Seminar of the American Academy of Religion, which was the first semi-permanent program unit of our national guild for the study of religion, which focused exclusively on the study of food. I say semi-permanent because the seminar has ended, but sort of another group rose from its ashes. So I'm going to talk a bit about the broad study of religion, politics, and food, and also what I've found in my own studies. In terms of the food seminar, and I promised the publisher I would talk about the book too, so we produced a book out of the seminar, to which Rachel contributed, as she mentioned earlier. The vast majority of the proposals we got to chapters in the book or papers in the seminar really had to do with these three issues, at least as defined broadly. Food is a lot more than just food. It's the stuff, obviously, but it's the process as well. So if we take food to mean not just the stuff you're eating, but the act of eating, the act of drinking, because food can be liquid as well, the act of growing, of cooking, of sharing, of producing, of distributing, then food means quite a bit and interacts quite a bit with those other two, religion and politics. Also, if we take religion very broadly, we see a lot of ways in which it connects to food. Religion can be institutional, in which case we can imagine how religious organizations or denominations publish official statements or take official stances on religion, on food and politics. Religion can also be individual. It can be spiritual. Religion can be embedded within the person, separate from institutions in some way. And finally, we can look at what I like to call quasi-religions. Things which aren't religions per se, but seem to look very religious. So some of the research I did is I interviewed people who are either vegetarians or locavores. If you don't know what a locavore is, it's someone who is dedicated to eating locally produced food, however locally is defined. And I found that a lot of those people, though not parts of official religions, were treating their association with food and their foodways in a very religious way. I call that quasi-religious because it's not necessarily a religion, but it looks like a religion. If we look at then religion, food, and politics very broadly, the vast majority of the proposals we had for chapters to be part of our book or papers to be given at our seminar had to do with those topics as they related to each other, particularly as they had to do with how individuals connected to communities and how people tried to embody the practice of eating. Eating is very, very bodily. It's certainly not unique in that way. But in that it's something that we all do, in that it's something which every religion that I'm aware of has rituals involving, or ceremonies or practices or beliefs. It's something which is directly relevant to all people, religious people in particular. One of the ways which I found helpful to look at the study of religion and food is to borrow a concept from the study of culture. In cultural studies, they have an idea called the circuit of culture. The circuit of culture begins with representation, production, consumption, identity, and regulation. This actually came out of folks who were studying the Sony Walkman, if you remember that. So now, of course, people have iPods, actually, iPods and related phones. But the idea is that any object of culture can be studied from different angles. I've condensed that a bit when I think about religion and food. I've condensed that 5 down to 4. Production, preparation, consumption, and conceptualization as all loci around which people need to wrestle with what are they eating, how are they eating, with whom are they eating, and what does that say, what is the meaning of that. To talk a little bit about my own research, because that allows us to really sort of focus in the individuals whom I spoke with, all of whom were, as I said, either locavores or vegetarians, I helped them produce oral histories. So basically I sat for between 1 to 3 hours, a little more than that in some cases, with folks and asked them to talk about what they ate, why they ate it, and how it related to other aspects of their life. And I would sort of ask them questions now and then. Mostly I just let them talk. What I found were, of these people that I talked to, and there were 20 of them, that all of them were deeply uncomfortable with what many of them called the standard American diet, or SAD, that is a great acronym, of mass-produced industrial food, which is faceless, nameless, and which often is the product, quite literally, of exploitative labor, destruction of the land, and is quite alienating from not only the means of production, to use a nice Marxist phrase, but the actual food itself. If you turn over your bar of candy and then read the ingredients, you can't pronounce half of them. I'm not the first person to make this remark, but one becomes alienated even from the food you're eating if you don't even know what it is. And all the folks I talked to were deeply uncomfortable with this reality. They wanted something which was authentic, which was true, and something that they could inscribe meaning into, and not just have it be something which they had to eat. The particular way they went about this either were vegetarianism, choosing to eat only plant or mushroom-based products, or for some of them, if they weren't vegan, dairy as well, or locavorism, choosing to just eat foods which were locally produced. I can't generalize all 20 of these oral histories that produced in the 4 minutes I have left, but just to give you a couple of generalizations. One of the joys of having a last name that starts with Z is I get to go last, so I got to hear what everyone else was saying. And actually, a lot of the themes they were bringing up were exactly what came out in these oral histories. And something that Jason talked about, he talked about his crises of vocation and his conversion. What I actually got were conversion narratives. Of the 20 people I talked to, every one of them gave me a conversion narrative about having a crisis where they discovered that the standard American diet was not working, that it made them uncomfortable, that it left them feeling meaningless, that they needed to make a change in their life in order to feel like they were having real, authentic food. And there's that issue of authenticity. I think most of the panelists have talked about that as well. They want authentic food. Now, the particular paths they chose varied. But that was a commonality. And in fact, about halfway through each of these oral histories, one of my sort of probing questions is, after they told me this, I said, well, have you ever thought about this as a conversion? And a few of them had, but a lot of them said no. But to explain what conversion, the ways that we have studied conversion, for all but one of them, they said, oh yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And the one who didn't like it actually didn't like religion at all, so she didn't like anything which reminded her of religion. But for all the rest, they said, yes, it really was a conversion, which gets to the heart of the real meaning and value that we find in food. If by changing one's food ways, those who are doing it actually think about it as conversionary, That's actually quite radical. That's actually quite powerful. The other commonality that emerged out of this was that for every one of these people, they were wrestling with their individual practices of consuming and how it related to communities of people and the earth. Eating is, on the one hand, a supremely individual act. You don't need anyone else to help you eat unless you're a baby or have some sort of medical condition. That being said, for every one of the people I talked to, they wanted to make eating not just about an individual shoving something in their mouth. They wanted to integrate eating and food either into communities or into systems of meaning having to do with the earth, having to do with plants and animals, having to do with God. And that was a commonality that people went about it in different ways, but every one of them had to deal with this. What I found most ironic and quite lovely is that the way in which people were trying to make sense of their identity and their community was actually through consumption. And that is very, very American, that we consume our identities, whether it's what you wear or what you eat. And while most of the folks I talked to had not thought too much about it, when I brought that up, I said, well, yeah, how else would I do it? It's through consuming that I define who I am. And that speaks quite a bit, not just to the 20 individuals who I spoke to, but I think to our broader culture. I see I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to all of the panelists for sharing about their own work. I want to begin the conversation part of this event by simply asking the panelists to reflect on each other's presentations and perhaps how they intersect with your own works. Any of you feel free to jump
in. It's interesting that, like you're saying, the idea of conversion and a couple connecting things, like what you were saying about the first act of brokenness or of sin or whatever you want to call it is an act of consumption. And then, many people inherently finding brokenness within how they're consuming food, and then having that conversion in the realm of eating is fascinating to me, and interesting that what does that mean? You know what I mean? I feel like that has a deeper meaning, and I guess that food, like you were saying, that food means a lot more than we, you know what I mean? It's like you're sitting, even this glass of water, like, has more meaning than just what it is. And I think that's why food is so interesting to talk about, is because there's an intersection of all the issues that we encounter as humans, whether it's agriculture or economy or morality or community, you know what I mean? And food, it all goes down to that. And interesting, like you said, the original story starts with the wrong food choice.
Maybe I have a question for the rest of y'all, is the politics of shame and how shame is experienced in regards to food consumption. I think that, actually going back to the Garden of Eden for just a moment, what happens after they have the birth of morality? They realize they're naked, right? They feel shame at their own nudity. They start to realize something of themselves. And I find in my own communities that there is a lot of shame and judgmental division that happens around food. For example, who keeps kosher, who doesn't, different levels of commitment within kashrut. Even there's different symbols. Yeah? So if you ever go to the food store and you buy something and you look at it, there's little symbols of whether it's kosher or not. But there's like a million different types of symbols. Some eat that one, they don't eat that one. So there's all these politics going on there. Then, as we shared, I happened to be, my wife and I became vegan on our wedding day, and we noticed that in the vegan communities, there's incredible animosity, and some of it towards the non-vegan world. And certainly people who eat meat feel very threatened oftentimes by vegans and that kind of conversation. There's all this kind of shame and judgmental stuff going on around meat, kashrut. I wonder in your own communities how sort of shame plays out and the judgmental, and sort of as you were saying that people are looking to come together. I think that unity is becoming more complicated as the choices expand and the details of concern expand.
I think that's a great question. Thank you for it. And I think that the food system is so complex that we really need some kind of nuanced reading. So on the one hand, we have these systemic structural injustices that require a very strong critique. And frankly, I'm not necessarily afraid of shaming these kinds of structures that oppress, right? But then when I think about a person working a minimum wage job who maybe doesn't have time to kind of look for the best price items. Maybe there's no access in their neighborhood. And so they really are eating the kinds of foods that we've sort of been talking about here as not authentic foods. I don't think shame is the appropriate response to that situation, clearly, because there's already a systemic oppression that's going on that's making it so that is the most reasonable option for them. So to me, it requires, for people of conscience, both a systemic structural analysis, but also an individual micro-analysis, or analysis probably isn't even the right word, but a structure of support for people who are struggling, who are getting crushed, really, by the system.
Shame is a powerful tool of self-identity and self-understanding. It allows one to think about and talk about and embody what's good and what's bad. Sure, all the individuals I spoke with invoke concepts of shame in talking about what their diets were like, what their food ways were like before their conversions. Of course, I was talking to converts, and as we know from the study of conversion, one of the things I discovered in my study is once we talk about food choices as conversion, we can use all the tools from the study of religious conversion. And one of the things we know is that converts tend to be extreme. And so certainly it's not a representative sample, but the folks I was talking to, they talked about it, they also were quite willing to shame others. And there's different variants within both vegetarianism and locavorism. But I'm glad about veganism. Vegans, the institutionalization of veganism within PETA, within the people of ethical treatment of animals, PETA is quite willing to shame those who are non-vegan. And they're doing it quite intentionally as a way to try to, in their minds, better the world. But this is evangelism. I mean, this is what we see in many religions, is the idea that we or I have discovered what's right, and I think it's right for me and it's right for you. Let me tell you about it. And sometimes shame is one of those tools.
I'll just add one quick thing about that. There's also a discourse about the use of shame in human rights discourse too. Like, you might have a state sign on to a treaty, even though they aren't really fulfilling all the elements of the treaty, and the responsibility of the international community is to sort of shame them into fulfilling their obligations. And so I think it's an interesting.
Okay. I guess I want to ask a question that Jennifer and some of the other analysts have mentioned, but I want to ask you about the work, the goals of your work, and or the work of people you study. What are you trying to affect? Are you trying to affect the large system? Are you trying to change the communities you live in, or they live in and work in? Or are you working towards personal change, whether it's your own person or the people around you?
Well, I think for me, I'm looking to change. I'm looking to wake people up. There's a certain, sometimes shamelessness in my community, and I think it's, in a climate of abundance, it's important to know and to remember and to act on the fact that that is not the whole picture.
what they believe about the food system, or for me, it's deeply theological. Helping the Christian community to see that food matters theologically. I'd like for a theology of creation to be developed. So for me, it's kind of like a large scale, like it's like a worldwide reformation. That's but it's born of like it's a drop in the water, and it's ripples that keep going. And I think you can only change what you can touch in what's in front of you, and then letting those ripples go out. And certainly in our community, the struggle is conventional industrial farming and the sustainable farming community. We would love to overcome their thinking with, sit down at the table and say, please, we don't want to shame you, but snap out of it, wake up, we want there to be radical change, radical in the sense that see things. It's hard because you want people to see things your way because you feel like it's right, and at the same time, being able to listen to them and understand them in a way that you don't shame them. We don't eat the same way, but we can have a conversation that maybe would be productive, for both of us. So I'm all about changing the world, but starting with one drop.
So there's this phrase I love called sustainable hypocrisy, which means that if somebody thinks you're a 10 out of 10 and you're kind of 7 out of 10, don't tell them you're a 7. Just pretend you're the 10 and then meet that bar, right? Use that to meet the bar. And so one of the things I love to be able to sit up here and pretend like I kind of got all this worked out is that I'm preaching to myself. It's like I'm inspiring myself to go to the next level after here. So I say this just to say that I'm talking more to myself than anyone else here. There's a story of Gandhi that I love. This mother comes to Gandhi and says, tell my son to stop eating sugar. It's not good for him. He says, come back to me in a week. She goes back in a week. Tell my son to stop eating sugar. Come back in a week. Tell my son to stop eating sugar. She says, don't eat sugar. And the mother says, that's great, but why did you wait all those weeks? And he said, because all those weeks I was still eating sugar. So he needed to get to the place where he wasn't eating anymore and to go to that place. So I see my work as doing, as you said with modeling, is to start off is to kind of work on myself and to improve my own personal practices. It's great to pick the one or two things I care about and go run around about them, but how am I making myself a model for within my family and beyond and in my community and beyond? But the things I do educate about, one, I educate the ethical sides of kashrut to those who keep kosher. I emphasize the value of kashrut in the Jewish community for those who aren't interested in kosher, so it's kind of both ends there. In terms of, but I'm interested in incremental change, going back to the PETA conversation, around the veganism. Veganism and vegetarianism has remained somewhat at the same level over the last number of years. I mean, since 2008, there's been increases in both, but it's relatively stable. But there's been a huge increase in meat reductionists, right? Those who are taking a meatless Monday or buying less or buying alternatives to milk or alternatives to eggs or animal products, whatever the case is. And so as someone who thinks that it's bad, as I believe it's bad for our health, bad for animals, and bad for the environment to be eating animal products, I don't go run around yelling that because that's not going to do very much. What I try to think with people about how we can, live more healthy and sustainable in more sustainable ways. And so I kind of try to balance my radical approaches with more measured approaches as well.
So as a practical theologian, I'm really interested in telling the stories and hearing the stories of people who are really engaged in this work. So I feel like I talked to a lot of people like you guys when I was working on the book, which is just such a, how can that be my job? That's just such a great job to be able to hear these stories. But I really liked what you said, Karen, about sort of being awake, waking people up, this wakefulness. And for me as a practical theologian, that sort of takes two forms. One is a wakefulness to the way things are, this sort of analyzing the food system, being fully aware of what's going on, and helping invite people into the conversation that can be really, feel really kind of like over all of our heads. I mean, the farm bill is 1,800 pages, for example. And I read somewhere that you have to have 13 different kinds of policy expertise to be able to even read and interpret it. And so, so I'm trying to like make some of it, I mean, I obviously don't understand all of it, but trying to make it accessible to people. But then also, the other kind of wakefulness is kind of unearthing the beauty of everyday people trying to do something, trying to be a different way, to live a different way. And I hope that the book will be helpful to them to just keep on keeping on, right? I don't think many of them, they say they want to change the whole system, but I don't think any of them are surprised when the system doesn't change that much, right? But they still have this joy in their work, and I think it has to do with their vocation. And so for them, I think this goal is to live a life of integrity according to their own kind of moral framework and making change where they can. And that's a real pleasure to hear those stories.
My own study of religion and food came out of the classroom. I teach and have taught in the Lord's colleges. And what really drove and drives me is wanting the students in my classroom to be able to think about religion as not just doctrinal, as not just what happens in a church or synagogue or a mosque or a temple or gurdwara, take your pick. But that religion is something which happens all over and throughout one's life. And that's what drove me to want to teach about religion and food, want to study about religion and food. Among scholars, certainly that I'm not among the vanguard, I'm part of a broad movement, and other people sitting in this room have worked on very similar topics. Marie Griffith's book, Born Again Bodies, looked at very similar ideas, sort of the practices of eating and other embodied practices as ways of understanding one's identity and working through one's religious self. Lee Schmidt's work in Practicing Protestants was looking at the way in which Protestants don't just think things, they do things. So among scholars, certainly this is very, very mainstream. But in the classroom, I found that when students walk in on day one, they still often think about religion as, I believe in A, B, C, and I go to building D. And I want them to think about it a lot more than that. I want them to realize that religion is embodied and religion is everyday. And religion happens at the dinner table and at what restaurant you choose to go to and what sort of coffee you're drinking. And it doesn't just happen in the head or in the pews.
As you all talk about what kind of changes you want to affect and you are affecting, would anybody like to talk about the kind of obstacles or pushback you've encountered in this work?
Oh man, it's elitist is the biggest thing. Is like it's not accessible. It's only for. And honestly, like you're saying about your own practices, there are times that that we struggle with just buying food, and so when I stand in the grocery aisle and I'm like, this organic item, or I can buy more of this, I mean that's there's an obstacle just within the sphere of my own practices. I'm wrestling with, is this accessible at times? But then others are addressing the local food movement or these other ways of reforming the food system and saying, you can't do that. You can't change agriculture that drastically. You can't change the way people eat. Or I'm a part of a food council locally where I live, and we want to help people eat better. But they don't want to eat better. You can't. You go to anyone in this room, you turn to your friend and say, you really shouldn't be eating that. All of us will bristle and be like, you're not telling me what to do. Because it's culturally ingrained. What you eat is culturally ingrained, first of all. And even deeper than that, it's familial. How your family taught you to, to eat long grain and wild rice, but not something else. There's a world of obstacles, and the biggest thing that I want to encourage people is changing the way that you eat and changing the way that we eat in America is not elitist. And it has to be, we have to do it.
Would anybody, you all have very thoughtful faces. Would anybody else like to speak to the obstacles, or should we move on?
I'll say something very briefly, although I think it's relatively obvious, which is that, so David Hume once said that individuals care more about the stubbing of their own toe than a death on the other side of the world. And I think to some extent that's quite true. We're very self-consumed in our own comfort, and that's just part of the human condition. And I think to actually curb desire for a higher value is something that many have not chosen to cultivate in their lives. I simply have a desire and I fulfill that desire. Viktor Frankl said that the moral moment exists in between stimulus and response. And that moment of I'm hungry, what does that now mean? Is something that we haven't educated in the school system to take that moment and actually think about it. And I myself fail all the time. My 14-month-old cries for something and she doesn't want the first 19 things I've offered her. And so the 20th thing I know is probably the worst for her in a lot of ways, but it's going to get her to stop crying. And so we fulfill that desire.
I'll just say briefly, I think that Sharon Welch described one of the challenges facing anybody who wants to do something in terms of addressing systems of injustice as often being vulnerable to cultured despair, meaning that every time you make a little bit of progress, then the response is, well, it really doesn't even touch this other issue or all these levels of issues. And I think that's a huge risk in this work, that once you kind of address one little corner, you're just reminded of all the corners that you didn't even know existed yet. And I think that's a pretty big obstacle.
I try when I'm teaching in my scholarship to point out the way in which food isn't just food, but sometimes people remind me sometimes food is just food. Why I'd said something like that. And it reminds me of several of what the panelists have said. Karen, I think you said something about the customers just want a sandwich sometime. Or there's the stinky poet analogy. Who cares what the poet smells like? The poetry's good. I mean, that's the issue that I think anyone studying or writing about or an activist involved in food waste has to deal with, is that food has layers and layers of meaning and layers of production and value and ethics. However, it is also just something you put in your mouth. It has particular tastes, and it costs a certain amount of money. And those are the two that are bumping up into each other. Food is its physical substance, which tastes like something, it costs something, it has to take time and money to produce. And food as systems of meaning. I don't have an answer.
I would just add that I think these times call for more thoughtfulness and possibly sacrifice, and I think that's really difficult. So I think there's a pushback from how hard it is to affect the kinds of changes that we're talking about.
Maybe on that note, looking forward, what do you see as the future? I want to ask two questions at once. So, what do you see as the future of the industrial food system or the food system at large? And also, if you want to answer this question, what do you see as the future interactions between religion and food and politics?
Oh man. Oh my goodness.
So what comes next?
What comes next is the collapse of the food system. There's a little hopeful. I mean, the food system is collapsing. It's slowly collapsing. Like, you may not wake up tomorrow and not be able to buy Twinkies, but it almost happened with Twinkies. But they came back. So, the way we are producing food we're close to creating another Dust Bowl out west. You know, I mean, like, that is like incomprehensible to me that we didn't learn from the Dust Bowl, or any number of issues like the spreading of sludge. Like, you know, you know, a lot of people don't know what biosolids are, but the wastewater treatment industry magically turns, you know, their stuff that they make into this magic fertilizer that's suddenly, you know, good for the soil. All these practices build up in the soil and in our bodies, and how many people do you know that are dealing with food allergies or food associated, you know, diet associated illnesses, and that's like skyrocketing. So that's what I mean by the it's a feast of consequence. We're coming up against the wall quicker and quicker, and you know, and that's not very hopeful. And that's why I think that there will be, and there is, an increasing amount of Christians and Jews and a whole host of different faith-based responses to seeing the need to heal our communities and to heal society. There will be an increasing response because there's an increasing amount of brokenness. No, I don't think I made that up, but it's, you know, I can't remember where I heard that, but you eventually we sit down to a feast of consequences, and the foolishness we reap, you know, you eventually, you sow the seeds, you reap the whirlwind, and I think we're going to see that, we are seeing that in the healthcare crisis. To me, that's the real healthcare crisis, is that our food is killing us, and that we're killing the earth in how we're producing food.
I think, yeah, that was a tough place to start, Jason.
Sorry, I just blew the bomb up right off the bat.
Well, I mean, you know, we all read the IPCC report last week, right? That the climate crisis is really seriously threatening collapse of the food system. So it's not, you know, I mean, it's something that we really do have to reckon with, I think. I want to answer the second part of the question. And I think that one of the things that I studied in the book were communities, religious communities who started growing their own food in places that are referred to as food deserts. It's a contested term because it's kind of defined from the outside according to what a community lacks rather than by the resources and assets within the community. And so I kind of always have to put like quotes around it. But these religious communities are starting to grow their own food. They're not going to wait for a supermarket to come. They're not going to place their future in the hands of the consumer capitalist model. They're learning how to grow their own food. They're remembering how to grow their own food. And some of them are reclaiming some of these practices from the oldest members of their communities before this kind of oral history and knowledge dies with them. And so to me, that is one way forward for religious communities to respond to this system so they can grow their own.
You know, so I guess this isn't very rabbinic of me to say, but on the one hand, I really think that religion is one of the greatest barriers to progress on a lot of these issues. The level of xenophobia and homophobia and sexism and just hate that comes out of religious circles is enormous, and how dogma ingrains unhealthy and unhealthy, just destructive practices. On the other hand, I think religion offers one of the greatest promise to address these issues. In that, I argue there's very few movements alive today in America. I mean, if you look at how you define a movement, what a movement requires to be considered a movement. I mean, maybe there's something of a labor movement, there's something of a gay rights movement, but a lot of these things, even though we hear little bits and pieces here and there, they don't operate like movements. But religious movements are incredibly powerful and organized in a lot of ways. And I think that to address this stuff, we need religion on board. and there's specific tactics that have to be approached from within each religious discourse, and ethos and pathos and logos, let's throw that in there too, that have to be employed to address this stuff. And I just want to name one other issue that I think about. So I've been involved with American Jewish World Service, which is kind of like the Jewish Peace Corps to some degree, in developing countries. And one of the things we've seen is how American trade policies have wiped out industries in other countries. The most obvious one we probably heard of is how we wiped out the corn industry in Mexico by giving subsidies and then dumping all those products and then below cost into Mexico. But 40 to 60% of the food that we give in aid to countries goes into transportation. A lot of it rots on the boats or however it's transported. It wipes out the local industry. It forces them to eat certain things that aren't necessarily what they want. And we call this aid while it furthers certain business here. And that those businesses are incredibly powerful. And the only thing that can beat those businesses is organized religion.
I see a growth in what I would call identity foodways. People who are really looking to what they eat as the way to define themselves. Locavores and vegetarianism are the two that I've studied, but I'm starting to look at the paleo diet, sort of paleo eaters, as an identity foodway. Raw food, foodies, and people who where they stay, where they vacation, with whom they dine is defined by seeking out sort of the certain types of cuisine. Gluten-free. Certainly, there's some people for whom that's a serious and quite more medical issue, but there's others for whom it's much more of a lifestyle choice. Low carb. I scribbled out a couple of eco-kosher. There's all sorts of different sort of identities that one can try on and one can use. Yet, as I think about it, it's very class-based, right? This is a very middle to upper middle class sort of way of functioning. If you live in a food desert, or if you're just trying to make ends meet, this is not the way you think about your food. So I was about to say I hate to sound like a pessimist, but we're all a bunch of pessimists. It sure looks pretty striated to me. Like you have, those at the bottom getting sick and dying, and those at top trying out different ways of identifying themselves with different foods that they're eating.
If I can just say one quick thing about that, which is that if you ask me, and this is pessimistic, what the strongest food movement is within the food movement, it would be hedonism. I think there's this return to almost like a paganism, this sense of like, I want to eat good food, I want like the best tasting food, I want to like study it and know it and make it and feel it and touch it, like I want to like be consumed by food. And this is like emerging. Even I see parts of it, in all communities, but I see it within my own Jewish community. People who want to kill animals. They want to shack them themselves, but because they want to feel the experience of being close to the killing experience. They feel they owe them, they get something out of them. So I think this pagan hedonism that's emerging, I think, is one of the biggest threats coming from within this conversation itself.
See, I would say that comes out of, historically speaking, in the last 10, 15 years, the slow food movement, which started out with really noble intentions, but that can devolve into either hedonism. I would, Epicureanism is maybe less judgmental way of phrasing it. The idea that it's a response to a rejection of industrial food production and consumption, right? But you're right, it can also lead to I guess hedonism is the right word. But there's a nobler side of it too. If you've read the Slow Food Manifesto, it's quite religious, quasi-religious. It doesn't talk about the divine, but it's talking about sort of healing the earth and sort of healing communities. I haven't read it recently, so I'm paraphrasing here. But it's quite religious in language, and if you look at the context of it, those are people whose livelihoods and cultures they saw as being destroyed by globalization and industrial food.
I think people are looking for embodied experience, and I think maybe that's why hedonism and Epicureanism and people, it's like coming out of modernism and postmodernism. It's like even the industrial world around us is embodied. People are looking for visceral experiences. They want to. For me, the first time I killed chickens. It was powerful. for me, because I realized that when I ate chicken, it meant that that chicken died. And it was, that was a profound experience, that I was taking its life so that I could live and feed my family. I had never experienced that before. When you have, chicken nuggets in front of you, and you're like, you don't think about that, although chicken nuggets aren't chicken, so that chicken didn't die, but people are looking for embodied experiences, and I think that's why food has become a religion for many people. They're not finding an embodied faith in our institutions, so they're making their own. They're returning to the earth instead of being ghosts just floating between heaven and earth.
I want to make sure to open up the conversation now. We have about 15 minutes if people would like to contribute their voices to this conversation and ask questions of our panelists. We have a couple of microphones. You want to shout?
I have a pretty loud voice. Well, first of all, I don't know if all of you have been to St. Louis before, and I've only been here for 40 years, so locally that doesn't really make me a native. But I did find out that my maternal grandfather was born in Hannibal, Missouri, so I think I can claim to be a local person. But welcome to St. Louis, all of you. I am intrigued by hearing your words and the fact that you literally represent the entire country. I mean, you're kind of east to west or north to south for us, and thank you very much for that. And also the fact that you're representative of various faith communities. I greatly appreciate that as well. So thank you. This is marvelous. I would just share a couple of thoughts, not necessarily questions, on just a couple of different things. First, I'm a native Texan and a practicing Catholic. And you helped to really remind me in a certain way of Catholic practices. And unfortunately, as my family has grown and changed over these years from a very small, everybody is Catholic, practicing Catholic, to we got a lot of these nuns in our family. I'm not talking about the religious ones. And so meals that always started with grace is no longer our practice, except for when I'm eating alone, which is frequently. And that says a lot to me. I think you just reminded me of what that says. Thank you for reminding me of what that says. The other thing that I would just share with you is I go to a beauty salon that's located in the city of St. Louis, and you may not know that we have the city of St. Louis and we have St. Louis County, and within St. Louis County there are 90 plus municipalities. But I started going because I wanted to go to, I live in University City, so you're just adjacent to University City, which, by the way, when I moved here 40 years ago, we had lots of delis and wonderful bakeries in University City. I'm sorry to say that many of them no longer in University City, but it was a great place to come. So she has a salon in the city of St. Louis, and she wanted to start a practice of helping people think about doing a contribution. And the idea she came up with was she puts a small basket in the front of her salon, which is on Grand Avenue. She has a little basket, and she just said to her clients that when they came, if they wanted to contribute to the community, particularly people close to where she works, they could just bring food with them and put it in the basket. It's your point of what I can touch myself with a finger. And so she started that, and her idea was that there were churches around. She was probably going to just take the food to the churches. But one day, a couple of women came in wish people used a bus. Lots of people used the bus during the pandemic. These two women came in one day, and the bus is right outside of where Marie's shop is, and they said, you know, we saw the food sitting here, and would you mind if would it be okay if we took some of the food that we collected? She was yes, I never even thought about that. But there are poor people literally getting on and off of the bus in front of where my shop is. And so she said to these women, of course, take whatever you want. You're welcome to take the food, and you're welcome to come back and get the food. She is one of these extremely wonderful people of the state. And I think it's even encouraged her in her own faith that was such a simple action that it had such an impact on people. So just to say, I think it's a wonderful St. Louis story, and I'm just happy to be able to share that with you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's good.
Thank you for sharing that.
I have
Other
a question
questions?
second about what you just said. Have you guys experienced any inner-city outreaches based on food and seen great success in travels or in support?
Well, there's a People's, I'm forgetting the official name now.
People's Grocery.
People's Grocery. Thank you.
That's
That's very close. It's in Oakland. It's near Armstrong, Berkeley. And we had an association with them for a while. We did fundraising events for them. I think they've been very successful in redefining some of the issues and changing, though many of those neighborhoods, especially West Oakland, are considered, you know, do the food desert thing. They've sort of they've reclaimed the conversation and the solutions, and not a faith-based group, but a group that gave themselves power, trying to give themselves back some power in their neighborhoods. And I just want to use this question as an opportunity to say that I think that faith-based groups are sort of an avant-garde in this respect, and that ultimately there'll be a question of need, and people will be forced to cooperate and make relationships. So that the more we make relationships now, and the ground that's been set, the better off we'll be.
Absolutely.
Yeah, can name just a few, and you might want to Google them later if you're interested. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, have heard of Will Allen and Growing Power, situated, I believe they were born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but they've also started some projects in Chicago and other places. That's a really important one that you can find lots of things about them. I believe his name is Malik Yakini in Detroit, Michigan, has also been doing some urban agriculture. So if you just sort of start looking for urban agriculture movement, that's where a lot of exciting things are happening. In Chicago, I worked a little bit with an organization called Growing Home, which started these urban farms in Englewood, which is, in 2012 at least, had the most incidents of violent crime in Chicago, but they had this full working farm there in Englewood. The last thing I'll say is that in Atlanta, the Georgia Avenue Church, Community Church, started the Georgia Avenue Food Co-op program. Georgia Avenue Community Ministries is the name of the organization, gacm.org. And what they did is you buy a membership in a co-op, and I think they have 7 or 8 different co-ops. And with your membership fee, you become a part of a voting body. You receive each week when you come to the meeting your food that came from the Atlanta Community Food Bank, but you're also participating in the governance of the organization. So it disrupts the charity model of food provision and really kind of moves it more toward the justice model where people are kind of exercising their own agency about how the food's going to be distributed and so on.
We all know how much tremendous waste there is in this country. My 3 out of 4 of my wife's grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and the main implication for me, well, one of the implications, is that this morning when I left Phoenix, Arizona, I left with a 3-pound bag of toothpaste and a shirt and a 40-pound bag of food. Those who didn't have access to food at one point in their lives oftentimes feel very afraid of where's the food going to come from and stuff. But we we do, I shouldn't say we, many of us don't do a great job around waste. There's enough food in the world for everyone, and the problem is the distribution. I think we need to put a lot more systems in place to make it easy. In life cycle events in particular, if you go to weddings or bar mitzvahs, whatever the case is, I think there's a tremendous amount of waste that comes out of these things, and I think it sends the wrong messages in addition to causing problems.
Restaurants too notorious for
Yes.
that. I read somewhere 30 to 40% of calories produced in this country go to garbage.
Maybe we'll take 2 more questions together. I don't want to go over time, but I do want to, if there are other questions.
Sometimes it feels to me like the current food movement is faddish, indulgent. You sort of mentioned, it's trendy, it's got identity. And I wondered to what extent might that serve to waylay the real issues, the moral, ethical, and environmental issues? Or no? Or is it good that people are doing whatever they're doing in that direction? Or is it dangerous? Or is it not matter?
And before you respond to that, maybe one more question. We'll just take them together. Do you have a microphone up there?
Yeah, but it's a separate question.
Yeah, well, we'll just ask them and then they can respond.
Okay, but it's directed at one of the...
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
So for Rabbi Shmuly, or I'm not sure you're okay. Do you find opposition from your Orthodox community or maybe other Orthodox communities because by taking the stance that kashrut is not necessarily a religious or like a textual thing that you need to abide by, but rather like also moral or ethical reason? And then a second question, how are the White House Hanukkah parties?
Do you want to start there?
You can start there and then everybody can reflect on that question.
So every year there's a White House Hanukkah party, and I've gone a few times to that. And they kosher the whole house, which means they make it all kosher, and they bring in all this food. And actually, it's kind of interesting because you've got the most influential people in the world in this room, like the ambassadors, the Supreme Court justices, Congress, the president, the vice president, and we're all the Jews. They're at the food table. It's like you can talk to them when you want, but they're at the sushi table. You know what I mean? But myself included. So the White House Hanukkah party is very nice. But to your first question, I just want to be clear that I do emphasize the textual ritual aspect of kashrut and feel very committed to that in the deepest sense. And there's a rabbinic debate about whether we give reasons or not to the 613 commandments. One side says we do them for obedience, and the other position says we do them for whatever reason we do them, but we can also ascribe reasons to those. And so in that latter camp, there are those who give an ethical reasons for those commandments, and that's the philosophical camp I ascribe to. And so even though I'm committed to kashrut as an enterprise, I believe that there are ethical underpinnings. And you're correct that there is some tension there. If I said, so for example, in the Orthodox community, one would not say that food was produced unethically, and thus it's not kosher, right? Rather, I would say it's kosher, but it wasn't produced ethically. I would side with the Orthodox community. There would be more of a comfort to say that those things that are not produced ethically are not kosher, sort of redefining what kashrut is about. So what I sort of say is it's kosher, but it's not fit for consumption, because I separate the ethical and the ritual sphere.
And if anybody else would very briefly like to respond to Rabbi Shafir's question, which is a great one to end on, about the trendiness of this food moment we're in, possibly obfuscating the real moral questions that are at stake.
I'll answer with the historian's words, which is that the particular manifestations may be trendy and faddish, but as long as we've had industrialization, which granted is not that long, a couple hundred years, there have been responses to our food system. If you go back to the 19th century, in different attempts to, in America, Great Britain, to recreate authentic food. Once people started moving into cities and working in factories as opposed to eating food which they had mostly produced or their neighbors had produced, immediately there's this anxiety about what are we eating? You look at Lloyd Sylvester Grant and sort of the other food reformers. So it's particular manifestations may look faddish, but as long as people have been eating industrial food, people have been nauseous over it.
Are you saying it's always been trendy?
Yes.
Like it's a trend that, you know what I mean?
Well, a trend which has lasted 150 years, is that a trend?
Right. Yeah. Does that mean it's permanent?
I'm going to go ahead and say that it's good, that it's faddish. I think it's making the means of production visible, and I think that that's a good thing at this time. And, that the other effects I think we have to ignore for the benefit of it becoming obvious or visible again.
And I do think that this is a role for religious communities to sort of embrace the opening that is there for people who are asking these questions for the first time and push through to those encounters with the people, land, animals involved in the food system.
I love the question, and I don't have a proper answer because I'm wrestling with it. I wrestle with it a lot, but I actually want to say that these labels are actually, and trends are in some ways inhibitors. I think that we become oftentimes more concerned with identity and community than moral consequentialism, which is to say, I'm sort of safe. I'm a Catholic, I'm a Jew, or I'm religious, or I'm a vegetarian, or I eat organic. We have these constructions that make us feel safe, and we don't actually ensure that the consequential good is achieved. So I think we need more radicals who don't just want bumper stickers and pins that are cute, but actually people who say, like, this stuff matters, like for hungry people, for people dying, for like suffering in the world, for the amount of human disease we have, and I won't settle for an identity marker and staying stagnant within some trend because I now have a comfortable community that's on board with it.